This is my last video on Glacier View. I've said this before. I've just recorded one done by Des, and I just want to read you just a few letters. There were many letters sent to the brethren. We don't have all of them, but here's 2 or 3. This one is from Larry Geraty, written to Elder Kenneth Wood, September 15, 1980. Dear Elder Wood, as a participant in the Sanctuary Review Committee at Glacier View Ranch, I am surprised and disappointed at the apparently biased way the results have been handled in the Adventist Review. First of all, to announce on the back page, August 28, variant views rejected, was at best a half-truth. The other half is that many of the views advocated by Dr. Ford were accepted by the consensus statements. Why was that not brought out? Are we afraid to publicly admit the progress we made in Colorado at arriving at a clearer, more biblically based doctrine of the sanctuary? Second, in your fuller report of the Sanctuary Review Committee, September the 4th, I wish the documents generated by the committee had been published in a different order, and that one of them had been more adequately introduced. Bill Johnson provided a very fair and helpful overview of the meeting, though the heading, the Sanctuary Review Committee, finds strong support for the Church's historic positions, does not accurately reflect the full story. In retrospect, it may have been wise for Bill to clarify what he meant by the consensus statements, reaffirm the historic interpretations of the Church, page 7, when those of us who were there know that certain previous historic interpretations of the Church were also not confirmed. In any case, it seems to me that Bill's article should have been followed by the 2 consensus statements, which were the real achievements of all the delegates. To give prominence to the 10-point statement suggests the committee was a trial of Dr. Ford rather than an attempt to deal dispassionately with the issues that he raised. Furthermore, in the editorial introduction to the 10-point statement, I think it should have been made clear that the assignment given to the committee of 6 was to succinctly point out the differences between Dr. Ford's position and those traditions taught by the Church. Unless I am misinformed, their task was not to attempt an overall evaluation of his document. So Dr. Geraty gets it exactly. This is what I've been saying in my talks. While the information in your editorial introduction is accurate, the total impression seems I don't have the second page. Oh, yes, I do. Well, part of it is missing. There's probably a line missing at the bottom of page 1. There know that in at least 7 of the 10 points, the consensus statements move significantly in Dr. Ford's direction. This is nowhere explicitly shared with your readers. Now, we didn't talk to Dr. Geraty. This was an independent opinion that the consensus statement moved towards Des. While I feel strongly about the criticisms I've made because I'm so anxious to maintain unity in the Church by attempting to tell the whole truth about what I feel was a very open and fair committee, I also want to commend you for publishing so promptly the documents generated by the committee. In doing so, you have put the whole Church in your debt, i.e. we haven't had to wait for Spectrum, Verdict Publications, or some other extra-denominational source. Cordially, Lawrence T. Geraty. So he's saying what we've been saying, quite independently. Excuse me while I find the next letter. This one sent to Elder Neil Wilson, Elder Bradford, Elder Wernick and Elder Duncan Eva by Fred Veltman, who was the head of the religion department at PUC at the time, and Des's boss while he was the latter half of when he was there. He wrote a very lengthy epistle. I couldn't find a copy of that, but I mentioned before that he felt that he'd been duped. Dear brethren, this letter is just a short addendum to my recent rather lengthy epistle in which I attempted to explain how many of the scholars in the church view the 10-point statement on Des's position and the consensus statement treating Christ in the heavenly sanctuary. To further support my arguments that many of us saw the 10-point statement as merely stating where the viewpoints of Des differed from the historical understanding of the various aspects of the sanctuary doctrine and methods of interpreting apocalyptic materials, I would call to your attention the way in which a number of reports were presented to the General Assembly. So let me make that clear. The 10-point statement, which was used to judge Des on the Friday afternoon, was showing the difference between his manuscript, the Glacier View manuscript, and the pioneer view of Ellen White, not the Dallas statement, not the consensus statements, but the traditional view. And it's important to understand this because if you read the Ministry magazine in the early pages closely, you will see that it doesn't say what Fred is saying. It implies that Des was judged against the Dallas statement with some parts of the consensus statement that agreed with the Dallas statement, and that was not true. I'm sure you'll remember that on a number of points the secretaries of the various groups reported as follows. Our group could not come to a consensus on this point. On this point we could not agree, and so we've given two views to set forth. On this point we recommend that the church give further study. These types of statement clearly indicated that the groups could not agree on some of Des's positions. Obviously they were not concluding that Des was wrong. Indeed, by such reporting it was clear that there were those in the various groups who were uncertain about the issues, agreed with Des, or recognised that we did not have enough evidence yet to say that Des was wrong. It surely seems to me, brethren, that any attempt to do justice to the views espoused by the Glacier View group must include the failures of the groups whose memberships included pastors, church administrators and church scholars to come to agreement. The implications of such non-agreement must surely be clear. In closing, let me add that while I've spoken from the perspective of one of the scholars, and that I have generalised my position as representing the viewpoint of many scholars, I surely admit that there were church administrators and pastors who were in agreement with these positions, and there were also some scholars who were not in agreement. Thank you for hearing me out. I find myself unable to overstate the seriousness of the situation for the future of church unity, whether in doctrine, organisation or mission, if these viewpoints, which are shared by many in the church, are not given their due consideration. Sincerely yours, Fred Veltman. I've got a lot of papers here that I'm not going to be reading. Here's a long letter to Pastor Eva from Bob Parr. And Bob Parr, this was a corker. Just want to make sure. Seem to have a page missing there. Which case, I better not read it. Oh, 1, 2, 3. All right. There may be some lines missing here, but we'll do our best. Dear Pastor Eva, 2 things have occurred recently that emboldened me to write to you and tell you how I feel about the current concerns in our church. This was written March 11, 1980. So it's about 4 months before Glacier View. These two things are the reading of your article for publication and the record of which paper I have the honour to be the editor, and the hearing of the tapes of Ray Cottrell's address to the Adventist Forum at Loma Linda. I am certain that you will be familiar with both of these statements. Having read your article entitled "Where Did Jesus Go at His Ascension?", I can only assume that your feeling is far from the teaching of traditional Adventism, which has Christ ministering in the holy place for more than 1800 years, until he went into the most holy place in 1844. It is unthinkable to me that a man in your position would have written such an article as you did, and that for publication a generation ago or even 2 years ago! But I applaud your honesty and your readiness to accept new light, and wish it could be said of many more, that they would recognise that truth is progressive and that there is no virtue on holding on to old concepts simply for holding on's sake. Please note that when I read your essay as a preliminary to publishing it, I understand all the implications of your approach. I also appreciated your courage. I recognise that you too would have thought carefully and long over your attitude and doctrinal stance. I congratulate you for your clear exposition, but most of all I congratulate you for what you did not say. To write on that topic, and never so much as mention the word sanctuary, must surely be something that will have the critics in a furore, and those with closed minds in a ferment of rage. I am delighted with your readiness to speak as you have done. God bless you for your forthrightness. And because I believe that you are a man of integrity and honesty, and because I personally have appreciated every contact I've had with you, and because you are respected in this country as few other General Conference officers are, I make so bold as to unburden my heart to you on the matters I shall presently deal with. Because I feel that the President of this division, Pastor K. Parmenter, has a right to know what I'm saying to you, I shall send him a copy of this letter. I do not want it thought that I am afraid to say what I feel has to be said, though I hate to add to this man's burdens, but because the present pressures must press sorely upon him, as they must upon you also. The hearing of the Cottrell tapes was the most mind-blowing experience I've had for a long time. I received them from Loma Linda last week, from an Australian there. At his request, I have had a set made and sent to Pastor Parmenter, who told me that he had not heard them when I checked with him by phone. I suggested to him that it be wise for him to hear those tapes before he leaves for the General Conference, which he does on March the 16th, as I think it to be. My summing up of the first impressions I've heard of the tapes may be set down as follows. 1. Compared with what Cottrell has done, Desmond Ford's talk to the PUC Forum is but a peep and a mutter. All the upset and all the baying of those who seek his blood seems entirely out of proportion when one considers how Cottrell completely blows the lid off the 2,300 days doctrine. No more can we proclaim to the world that we adhere to the sola scriptura aspect of theology. Cottrell makes it abundantly clear that Scripture does not teach the 2,300-day prophecy to mean what we have traditionally taught. 3. If Ford is to be impeached for his un-Adventist doctrines, Cottrell must surely be excommunicated. While Ford merely gave a forthright statement that he believed that it was impossible to substantiate the sanctuary doctrine from the Scriptures, Cottrell has proved without any beg pardons at all that it is impossible to do so, and that we have known this in high places for many years but have been guilty of a gigantic cover-up. When the people find out this, there are some who will find the climate mighty uncomfortable, I would suggest. There will be charges of dishonesty and prevarication by silence against them. And I am sad to say that the White Estate and the editors of the Bible commentary will hardly escape. 4. Cottrell's conclusion is a complete double somersault. When, after convincing his audience that the 2,300-day doctrine, with the traditional view of the sanctuary doctrine, is untenable from Scripture, he then asserts his belief in it by saying that he holds it to be truth because Ellen White says so. Frankly, he's fooling himself, but he will fool few others. Time and again, Ellen White has said that we must test her writings by the Bible. Now, when the test is called for, we do a theological backflip if we agree with Cottrell, and test rather the Scripture by EGW. What hypocrisy! If the brethren at the General Conference try to foist that upon an aware constituency, they will find that they will have all the elements of a split church ready-made. Now let me make a few comments as to my own feelings and the feelings of some who've also heard the tapes and who have commented to me. Please believe me when I say that the only tapes I've sent out personally are those which went to Pastor Parmenter, though I may allow one or two selected friends to hear mine. However, I do not have the means or the inclination to scatter any man's tapes, Cottrell or Ford's, like the leaves of autumn, but they are being sown broadcast nonetheless. Here, for what they may be worth to you, are the comments which have come back to me. 1. We have been misled by a hierarchy, an unpleasant word, but that is the term which is increasingly used, which knew these things but which has elected to cover up the truth. If they have done this, they can hardly be trusted in matters which are equally important. The man who spoke in the 1919 Bible Conference and said that if they covered up their findings then, there would be terrible troubles in the church when the church eventually found out, spoke a great truth. I sense Pastor Eva a distrust for the leadership which I've never sensed before, and this is not pleasing to me. I regard myself as a completely loyal Seventh-day Adventist, loyal to my own leadership, loyal to the brethren of the GC. But this current revelation is doing nothing to bolster one's confidence in the leadership. What can restore it is not in my providence to suggest, but I can only think that complete honesty and forthrightness with the people would be a beginning. I am aware, of course, that the present leadership has inherited much of the situation, but if they perpetuate it, they will reap an untimely harvest, I fear. If Ford is ecclesiastically decapitated, or if he is silenced because of what he said, then justice will be trampled in the dust if Cottrell is allowed to continue his way unchallenged. It is my personal wish that neither of these men be silenced. God knows we need scholars who will speak the truth and bring fresh insights to the people. I know these men, both of them, to be men of God. I know these men, both of them, though my connection with the latter was somewhat brief. I believe them to be men of God. I believe we need them both, and though I do not believe that Raymond Cottrell's final conclusion holds a drop of water, I honour him for being a man who was willing to tell what he found, even if he would not adhere to the sola scriptura principle at the end. To cut out the tongue of one of these men and not the other would be discriminatory in the extreme and cause more harm in the short run and the long run. The facetious remark by Raymond Cottrell to the effect that he was a little put out that he was not given 6 months on full pay to study his position is quite reasonable in the circumstances. If it all comes back to the question as to why Ford is being made the scapegoat here, if Cottrell is deemed to be the Lord's goat, to continue the analogy, and allowed to go free, which isn't quite in the analogy, is it? 3. I can be as good a Seventh-day Adventist without the sanctuary as I ever was with it, is something that I am hearing increasingly. Come to think of it, so can I, and so apparently can you. Your article did not mention the sanctuary, which must have been a surprise to other readers besides myself. Whether they applauded your stance as much as I do, I cannot say. Your article, incidentally, has not yet been published. I've taken pains to point out to Alf Jorgensen and to Pastor Parmenter that the publication of your article will bring a storm around their heads. Nevertheless, I say to you that I applaud what you have written. I too have examined myself concerning the sanctuary doctrine and my relationship to the Church, and come up, as have so many others, with the thought that my standing as a loyal member of the Church is in no way compromised if I do not believe that Christ was ministering for 1800 years in a small room in heaven before he went into the Father. Indeed, I have not so believed for many a year, but have rather embraced the two-phase ministry of Christ in heaven, as so many have done. But I've never promulgated this interpretation in any way. Years ago, I said to my wife, "You'll never hear me preach about the sanctuary." This was mainly because I felt it was not my place to stir unnecessarily, so I elected to remain silent on a non-essential, as I saw it, issue. That is about all I ever said, and even today, when new revelations are being made, I'm not jumping into the fray to contribute my 2 cents worth. Better minds than mine, blah, blah, blah. It's here at the top. Better minds than mine are concerned with these issues, but these better minds are bringing information to me which I dare not ignore. That goes for a lot of the people I've spoken to who have written to me. Again, I say it, my relationship to God's church is not altered one whit because this cherished doctrine is revealed to be passé. And if 1844 is a non-event, as Cottrell proves to everybody but himself, so what? Why can't we be big enough to out and say it? That is our chief trouble. The don't rock the boat philosophy is so ingrained into our thinking that anyone who dares to trespass onto new territory, to change the metaphor, to seek to mine nuggets of truth, is regarded as a villain and as someone who has the upset of the church as his goal. Believe me, Pastor Eva, I have no brief for Robert Brinsmead, but I admire him for the capacity he's had for saying, I made a mistake, I'm embarrassed by some of the things I put my name to in the past. Would that we were as honest and as courageous. 4. People have said to me, especially those who've heard the tapes of Cottrell's Loma Linda presentation, that they see no real problem. Why cannot people who want to believe in the 1844 story be allowed to do so without ridicule or embarrassment? And why equally can't those who want to see the pre-Advent judgment as a Christ event at Calvary be allowed to hold those beliefs if that is their conscious thought? And why can't those who want to see no connection between Daniel 8:14, etc., and the judgment be allowed to cherish these views if they honestly believe such? Is not the church big enough to gather them all into its congregations? Are we so ironclad that we must out-papacy the papacy in dogma? Surely these are reasonable questions. Why is it that we must rake people with crossfire if in some aspect of doctrine they have a different slant from that which the administration has, especially if such interpretation is subjective, as the sanctuary hermeneutic must surely be seen to be? Of course, you and I can see difficulties inherent in such an approach, mainly because these beliefs have been promulgated since Hiram Edson's cornfield vision, so-called old traditions die hard. Then Ellen White has said, I was shown that the sanctuary doctrine was thus and so. How can we gainsay that? But let us not forget that Ellen White also said, I was shown about the shut door theory, see a word to the little flock, and we hold her in no less esteem because she released her hold on that doctrine. You and I and a million others still have confidence in her. 5. We are possessed of a more aware laity today than we ever have been. Raymond Cottrell in his Loma Linda tapes has said something to the effect that we have more PhDs per head of population than the American average. I would believe that. Moreover, as one visiting American said to me once, we'll soon have to have a master's degree before they'll let us teach Sabbath school. We are a very education-conscious people, and an educated constituency must be an aware constituency. You must have sensed that the audience at Loma Linda did not agree with Cottrell's final conclusions, that in spite of the evidence, the sanctuary doctrine was still truth, in spite of what the Bible said, simply because Ellen White reinterpreted it to mean what we traditionally had taught. Moreover, this army of trained ministry and aware laity will not accept a "thus saith the brethren" as they might have a couple of generations ago. Right now, I sense an angry response to the Cottrell tapes beginning to come to the boil. People feel they have been duped. They feel they may have been led to adhere to a doctrine which simply, and I can't read that line. As a man said to me yesterday, thank God we have righteousness by faith clear now. Otherwise, this new thing could have desolated us completely. That man is a layman, but his remark indicated to me that he is thinking clearly. When anyone understands the gospel, as I regret to say some of our people and even our leaders do not understand it, such an upset of doctrine does not throw you into confusion as it would otherwise do so. Let me make a final confession to you. When I first heard the Cottrell tapes, I was angry. I was not angry with the speaker, but angry with my church, something I never thought would happen because I've done my utmost in promulgating its doctrines and its standards and its teachings ever since I was a young man of 19 and I graduated from Avondale College. Most of my working life has been in what we call the organised work, but yesterday I was angry because truth has been swept under the carpet, because honesty had been given a deadly wound, because one man had been called to account when another's even more damning evidence has been ignored, because peace at any price has become the slogan, and that price is truth and honesty, because bigotry in high places has been uncovered, because sola scriptura, which the church has piously intoned for more years than I can remember, has been a mere sham and a fraudulent claim, because the little people of the church have been misled by men who would not trust them with the truth as they knew it to be, because a grand old lady has been elevated to a place where she would not have allowed herself to be, to the detriment of truth and right. These things, Pastor Eva, stir me to write to you this morning. I regret that I feel this way, but I also believe that I represent the feelings of many of the honest, sincere people with whom I have contact. Let me repeat that these present revelations in no way compromise my adherence to the principles of our church, nor do I feel in any way less of a Seventh-day Adventist than I have ever done. But I pray God that out of this present theological morass we shall find a plain path that will lead this church to final victory, and that we shall follow that greater light which will never lead us into error. I apologise for taking up so much of your time. I assure you that I pray for the officers of the General Conference and my own leadership every day. Well, Bob Parr lost his job as editor of the Record for writing that letter because our friend Dean Jennings saw it and without permission sent it everywhere, which he should not have done, but that would actually be a good place to finish. I've just got a few things. It's a grand letter. I've just got a few things to say about the Ministry magazine. I just want to go over again the way that Des was fired. The church planned ahead that Des was going to be fired, although in the letter of Parmenter and Wilson, they talk about how they pleaded with him and they pleaded with him, but they gave him the only option to follow the traditional beliefs. Now, they say that the standard was the Dallas Statement, but when they gave him the 10-point statement, which they used as evidence that he must change his mind on what he believed and say that he'd been in error, that was not comparing Des's manuscript to the Dallas Statement or the Consensus Statement. It was comparing it with the original traditional view of Adventism. And I think that despite what it says in the ministry about the Dallas statement, and you'll note in Parr's letter, which I'm not going to read again, but he goes back to Dallas. And they set up those 27 fundamentals, as I've mentioned, in order to deal with Des 4 months later. But as happens, those 27 fundamentals ended up at Andrews, and some of the scholars changed it and brought things in that the GC men didn't recognise. They didn't recognise the difference, the advances of the Dallas statement from the traditional view. Now, on the second, I think it's the second page of the Ministry magazine, let me just read a paragraph. Let it be clearly understood, this is page 2, introduction, column 3, about a quarter of the way down. Let it be clearly understood that what we have printed in the question and answer section is not to be taken as the official view of the Church on the sanctuary doctrine. We have only one official view, the Statement of Fundamental Beliefs voted at our April 1980 General Conference session. Even Christ in the Heavenly Sanctuary, adopted at the Glacier meeting, is not the official view of the Church, other than the portion taken from our fundamental beliefs. Now, that paragraph is very important because, as I've said several times, but because it's complex, I'm saying it again, that Elder Parmenter stood up in the first meeting and said that they had come up with the Dallas Statement and the 27 fundamentals, and the Church was not going to divert from it that week. And he followed through. And let me just have a look at it. On page 7, which is written by Bob Spangler, when he talks about Neil Wilson's early meeting, he doesn't mention what he said about the Dallas Statement. It's interesting what is not said. On page 8, I wanted to point out to you something else that I think is deceitful, intentionally. I'm not going to judge the motives. Elder Spangler mentions a letter that was written and all the untruths in it, and he said, this same letter also inaccurately reported an impassioned presentation by Pastor R.H. Pearson. The fact is that Pastor Pearson, being unable to attend the meeting, was not even present. Well, his letter was read out to the group, as I've mentioned to you before, and it was as though he was present. And the letter, I can't think of the other man who couldn't come, who was the chairman of the 1960s meeting. He was a British man and he was the ministerial secretary. He said the opposite to Pearson. He said Desford has not come up with anything new. We dealt with it all in the 60s and didn't make a report. Now, that's very much from memory, but that's the essence of it. And I think that that is misleading. Somebody misunderstood and thought Pearson was there. No, he wasn't there, but he wrote a very influential letter, and the letter was full of things that were not true. I want to emphasise again that I wasn't important there. I was just there as Des's wife, but everything they said about me, except that I was emotional in the last meeting, wasn't true. All said behind my back. None of it checked with me. And if I did say something, they didn't believe me. And I think that is very, very poor. And just one more thing. This is Spangler again on page 4. And it talks about Des not doing enough to counteract the work of Verdict Publication, a dissident organisation that not only has energetically promoted forged tapes and materials, and so on. And I told you, I looked into that, not true at all. Never sent anything of Des's out. Anyway. Just a correction. I said at the beginning of the week at Glacier View, Elder Parmenter made a statement about the Dallas fundamentals, and of course I meant Elder Wilson. Thank you.